On Christmas Day, 1995, Dean Martin died alone in his Beverly Hills home. Not alone in the sense that no one cared. 8 children spread across 3 marriages were out there. Frank Sinatra, the man he had stood beside on more stages than either of them could count, was still alive. The whole world still knew his name. That's Amore still played in restaurants on Christmas Eve. Alone in the sense that mattered. The kind of alone that settles into a man after he has lost the one thing no amount of fame or whiskey or laughter can replace. His son had died 8 years earlier on a mountain in California, in a jet he was too young to be flying. And from that day in March of 1987, the people who knew Dean Martin best said the same thing, in different words, in different decades, that the light went out, that the man who had made the whole world feel like everything was fine had nothing left to say that was fine about anything. His daughter Diana said it was tough for him. His friend Paul Anka said it was a huge turning point. An author who knew him in his final years described it as looking at a candle without a flame. Dean Martin had been many things in 78 years. Dino Crocetti, the son of an Italian immigrant barber in Steubenville, Ohio, who dropped out of school at 16 to bootleg whiskey and deal cards in the back of a tobacco shop. Kid Crochet, the welterweight boxer with broken hands who couldn't afford to wrap them properly. Dino Martini, the singer who crooned in Ohio roadhouses for tips. Then Dean Martin, the name a bandleader handed him, the name the whole world eventually learned. He was also a husband, 3 times, to 3 very different women who each got a different version of him and each lost something they couldn't get back. Betty McDonald was first. She was there before the fame, raising 4 children in cheap apartments while he chased something she wasn't sure he was ever going to catch. She got the hungry version of Dean Martin, and when he finally caught it, he left her for a woman he'd met at a Martin and Lewis show. Jean Beager was second. She was a beauty queen from Miami, and she got 24 years of the king of cool. She bought a ranch with a golf course to try to keep him home. She raised 3 children. She watched him fall in love with someone else, and finally filed for divorce, walking away with $6.5 million and a broken heart disguised as a settlement agreement. Kathy Horn was third. She got an extravagant wedding with 22 cages of white doves and flowers flown in from France, and she got 3 years before he realized he had married the wrong woman. Again. And all 3 of them, in their different ways, competed for a man who was only ever fully present on a stage, and who spent the last 8 years of his life not wanting to be on a stage at all. This is the story of the 3 women who loved Dean Martin, the son whose death ended him, and the man behind the most convincing performance of effortless cool in the history of American entertainment. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Steubenville, Ohio, in 1917, was a town built on steel and smoke, sitting on the Ohio River about 35 miles west of Pittsburgh. And it was exactly the kind of place that produced men who either stayed forever or spent the rest of their lives running from it. Dino Paul Crocetti was born there on June 7, 1917, above his father's barbershop at 319 6th Street. His father, Gaetano, had come from Montesilvano in the Abruzzo region of Italy, had arrived in America with almost nothing, and had built a respectable small business cutting hair in a town that needed its haircut. His mother, Angela, was Italian-American, from Fernwood, Ohio. Neither of them spoke much English at home. Dino's first language was Abruzzese, a dialect of southern Italian, and he didn't learn English until he started school at 5 years old. When he did start school at Grant Elementary, the other kids bullied him for the way he talked. He was, for the first years of his formal education, the Italian kid who couldn't speak properly, and it left him with an inferiority complex about his own voice that would, in an extraordinary irony, follow him into a career built entirely on the way he spoke and sang. His daughter Diana, in her family memoir, described her father's Steubenville childhood the way he had described it to her. A close-knit Italian neighborhood that worked as its own extended family. bocce ball in the lots behind the houses, swimming in the Ohio River, church every Sunday at St. Anthony's where Dino and his older brother Bill served as altar boys, and his father's barber shop at the center of everything. It sounds almost warm. It was also, by the time Dino was a teenager, a town that ran on illegal money. Steubenville, during and after Prohibition, had become, in the phrase his biographers have used more than once, a wide-open city. Steel mill workers came off 12-hour shifts, needing somewhere to put their paychecks, and Steubenville was ready for them. There were a dozen pool halls and cigar stores downtown, with backroom gambling operations running day and night. Bookies worked out of barbershops. Bootleg whiskey moved through the neighborhood in car trunks. It was the kind of town where a smart, streetwise boy with no interest in a formal education could find work easily, and Dino Crochet was exactly that boy. He dropped out of Steubenville High School in the 10th grade. His explanation, which he repeated for decades and which nobody who knew him in that period disputed, was that he thought he was smarter than his teachers. He probably was, at least in the ways that mattered in Steubenville. He could read people, he could calculate odds, he could keep his face still while his mind was moving. These were not skills they taught at Steubenville High. He went to work. He took a job at Weirton Steel for a while. He delivered cases of bootleg whiskey to Cannonsburg, Pennsylvania for extra money. He dealt blackjack and worked as a croupier behind the counter of a tobacco shop that had a backroom casino. And then, at 15, he started boxing. He billed himself as Kid Crochet, which was either a deliberate play on his last name or a spelling error that stuck, depending on which account you read. His friends called him Punchy, and not affectionately. The nickname came from the fact that in his very first fight, he was knocked out on the first punch. He kept going anyway. He fought 36 professional bouts as a welterweight, won some of them, and collected a broken nose, a disfigured little finger on his right hand, a split lip, and permanently damaged knuckles from boxing without the hand tape that more funded fighters could afford. He said later, simply, that he liked it, but it didn't last long. The singing had always been there, running underneath everything else. He had been doing it his whole life. Italian folk songs for the family, then pop songs he picked up from records. His idol was Bing Crosby. He would sit in the back room of the casino where he was dealing cards and listen to Crosby on the radio between hands. He started singing with local bands on weekends, calling himself Dino Martini, which was both a nod to his Italian roots and a deliberate echo of Nino Martini, a famous opera tenor of the era he admired. In the late 1930s, he got picked up by the Ernie Mackay Orchestra, then by the Sammy Watkins Band, which toured the Ohio region and gave him real stages to practice on. It was Sammy Watkins who suggested he change his name. Dino Martini was too ethnic, too Italian, too obviously borrowed. What he needed was something American enough to put on a marquee without making booking agents nervous. Watkins suggested Dean Martin. Dino took it. He would spend the rest of his life answering to a name that wasn't his, which was, in some ways, perfect preparation for playing a character called the King of Cool that wasn't entirely his either. By the early 1940s, he was in New York, singing on a 15-minute radio program and working the club circuit. He was 23 years old, broke most of the time, and already carrying the particular combination of charm and detachment that would define him for the rest of his life. And in Cleveland, Ohio, he had already met a woman named Betty McDonald. The Jerry Lewis years were the most successful and the most exhausting period of Dean Martin's professional life, and the two things were not unrelated. By 1949, the year Dean divorced Betty and married Jean, Martin and Lewis were on their way to becoming the biggest comedy act in America. They had a radio show. They had a deal with Paramount Pictures. They were performing at the Copacabana in New York to sold-out crowds that lined up around the block. They were on television, which was new and terrifying to most entertainers, and which Martin and Lewis took to immediately, because what they did was essentially live performance, and television was live performance with a camera pointed at it. The formula was simple and endlessly renewable. Dean would set up a song, serious, smooth, completely in control. Jerry would destroy it. Dean would react with the long-suffering patience of a man who had been put on earth specifically to be inconvenienced by this particular lunatic. Jerry would escalate. Dean would absorb it. The audience would lose their minds. Then Dean would sing the song beautifully while the smoke cleared. It worked every single time. What the audience did not see, because Dean Martin never let audiences see things he didn't want them to see, was how much of the act's architecture was his. Jerry Lewis was the visible genius, the physical comedian, the one who threw himself around the stage and got the big laughs and the magazine covers. Dean was considered, by people who didn't look carefully, to be Jerry's straight man, the handsome prop that made Jerry's antics more visible by contrast. This was a misreading that Dean lived with for years and quietly resented. The truth, which Jerry himself eventually acknowledged, was that Dean's comic timing was the engine the whole act ran on. Every beat Jerry hit landed because Dean had set it up. Every escalation worked because Dean had established the baseline. The straight man is the harder job, requiring the kind of precise invisible skill that doesn't get applauded because it's not supposed to be noticed. Dean did it with a naturalness that made it look like he wasn't doing anything at all. That, too, was the performance. Between 1949 and 1956, Martin and Lewis made 16 films together for Paramount. My Friend Irma, At War with the Army, Scared Stiff, The Caddy, Artists and Models. Each one bigger than the last, each one printing money for the studio. Dean became famous in a way that Betty MacDonald had never quite seen coming when she married a club singer from Ohio in 1941. He was on the cover of magazines. He was recognized everywhere. He was, by the early 1950s, one of the most famous men in America. And he was, at home with Jean and their growing family, almost entirely absent. The marriage to Jean had started with genuine feeling, whatever the circumstances of its beginning. Jean Bieger was not a naive woman. She had known, when she got involved with Dean, that he was still married to someone else. She had understood what kind of man she was taking on. She was 20, composed, and clear-eyed about Hollywood, in a way that many women her age were not. She moved into Dean's world with her eyes open, and for the early years of the marriage, the deal seemed to work. They had 3 children together. Richie was born in 1953, Gina followed in 1956, and Dean Paul, who everyone called Dino Jr., came in 1951, the firstborn of their marriage, the boy Dean would love with a particular intensity that set him slightly apart from the rest. Dino Jr. was his golden boy. Everyone who knew the family said so. Dean saw something in that kid, some combination of his own charm and his mother's composure that made him different to look at, even in a household full of children who needed looking at. The household was also, by the mid-1950s, increasingly a household that Dean moved through rather than lived in. The Paramount pictures, the radio show, the television appearances, the nightclub bookings, the schedule was relentless. Jan managed everything at home. She ran the house, raised the children, handled the social obligations that came with being married to a major star, and did all of it with the kind of undemonstrative competence that never made the columns because it didn't make good copy. What also didn't make the columns, for years, was the distance that was growing between them. Dean's drinking had always been part of his image, and the image wasn't entirely fiction. He drank steadily. He was at his most comfortable in rooms that were loud and full of people he could perform for. The domesticity of a family home, the school runs and the dinner table and the Saturday mornings, was not territory he moved through with the same ease. He showed up for it. He was not unloving, but there was always somewhere else he needed to be, and he usually went there. The Jerry Lewis partnership ended in 1956. The break was abrupt, painful in the way that endings between two people who have been professionally intimate for 10 years are painful, and it left Dean in a position that frightened everyone around him except Dean himself. The consensus in Hollywood was that Martin was finished without Lewis, that the act was Jerry, and Dean was the furniture, that without the comedy to hang on to, the crooning Italian straight man from Ohio would slide back into the club circuit and disappear. Dean ignored all of it and went to work. Within a year, he had recorded Memories Are Made of This, which went to #1. Then, That's Amore. Then, Everybody Loves Somebody. He made Rio Bravo with John Wayne and proved he could carry a film alone. He signed with Frank Sinatra's Reprise Records. And when Sinatra assembled the Rat Pack for the Ocean's 11 shoot in 1960, Dean Martin was not a straight man looking for his comedian. He was the second biggest name in the room, and he knew it. The King of Cool was fully constructed by 1960. Relaxed, a little drunk, always amused, never quite trying, the glass never quite empty. It was the most successful character in American entertainment, and it was built on the same principle as the Jerry Lewis Act, making the difficult look effortless, at enormous personal cost, for the benefit of an audience that never needed to know how the trick worked. Jeanne knew how it worked. She had been living with it for 11 years by 1960, and she would live with it for 13 more before she finally stopped. Jean Bieger had been, before she became Jeanne Martin, Dorothy Jean Bieger of Coral Gables, Florida, and she had been beautiful enough and poised enough to win beauty pageants in a state that took beauty pageants seriously. She was 20 years old when she attended the Martin and Lewis show in Miami in 1948. She had been invited by friends. She sat in the audience and watched Dean Martin work the stage, and then she was introduced to him after the show, and within a relatively short time she understood that she was going to marry him, not because he swept her off her feet in some dramatic way, because she was a practical woman who understood men, and she understood this one well enough to know he was worth the complications. The complications were real, and she had walked into them knowingly. He was married. He had children. He was on the road most of the time. He was charming in the way that men who are charming to everyone are charming to no one specifically, which meant you were never quite sure if the warmth you were receiving was personal or professional. Jeanne figured it out. She decided it was enough. For the first decade of the marriage, it mostly was. The 1950s were good years for the Martin family in the ways that mattered publicly. Dean was rich. He was famous. They had a beautiful home in Beverly Hills. They had children who were healthy and well-dressed, and photographed for the fan magazines in the way that healthy, well-dressed children of famous fathers were photographed. Jean was everything a Hollywood wife of that era was supposed to be. Composed, elegant, never embarrassing, always on the right side of the room at the right party. What she was doing underneath that composure was a different matter. She was, by every account of people who knew the family, holding an enormous amount together with very little help. Dean's schedule was relentless. His tolerance for domestic life was limited. He loved his children, genuinely and visibly, but love in his case expressed itself in presence on special occasions and absence on most others. He was a man who could make a room full of strangers feel like they were his closest friends, and who sometimes found it harder to sustain that warmth with the people who actually were. There were also, and this is where the biography gets careful, other women. Dean Martin's reputation as a ladies' man was not a pure invention of the publicity department. He was, in the language of the era, not a faithful husband. Whether any of the liaisons were serious, whether any of them were more than the casual arrangements that the Rat Pack world both enabled and normalized, is something that was never fully documented while he was alive. What is documented is that Jean was aware and absorbed it, and made the calculation that most women in her position made in that era, that the marriage was worth more than the affairs were worth making a scene about. By the late 1960s, that calculation was becoming harder to sustain. The Rat Pack years had been enormous for Dean professionally and corrosive in every other way. The drinking that had always been part of his image had become more genuinely the thing itself. The schedule had, if anything, gotten worse. He had a television show, The Dean Martin Show, which ran from 1965 to 1974 and was watched by 40 million people a week, and he spent roughly as much time preparing for it as a man who genuinely didn't seem to be preparing for it at all, which was part of the genius and also part of the problem. He was also making Matt Helm's spy films, continuing to record, continuing to perform in Vegas. There was no off switch. And somewhere around 1968 or 1969, A Beverly Hills salon receptionist named Catherine Horn entered the picture. Jean found out. She did not find out dramatically, not the way Debbie Reynolds found out about Eddie Fisher. She found out the way women who have been paying close attention to their husbands for 20 years find out about things. Gradually, through accumulation, through the small changes in schedule and mood and attention that add up to a conclusion she would have preferred not to reach. In December of 1969, Jean publicly announced she was filing for divorce. Her statement named Dean's relationship with Catherine as the reason. She was 42 years old. She had been married to Dean Martin for 20 years. She had raised 7 children between them, her 3 biological and Dean's 4 from his first marriage, all of whom had spent time under her roof at various points. Before the filing was even complete, she did something that tells you everything about who Jeanne Martin was and how well she understood the man she had married. She purchased a ranch, Hidden Valley Ranch, near Thousand Oaks in Ventura County, with a golf course on the property. Her reasoning, according to their son Richie, who wrote about it in his memoir, That's Amore, was entirely clear-eyed. She thought if she bought Dean a golf course, he might come home more. She bought her husband a golf course to keep him home. He didn't come home. The divorce dragged from 1969 to 1973, 4 years of legal proceedings that became, at the time, one of the most expensive celebrity divorces in Hollywood history. When it was finally settled, Dean told his lawyers, in the line that got quoted everywhere, "Give her whatever she wants." She wanted quite a lot, and she got it. $6.5 million in cash, the family home in Beverly Hills, several cars, a significant portion of other assets. In today's money, the settlement would be worth many times that figure. He said he knew it was the gentlemanly thing to let the wife file, he said, with the grin that never quite left his face even when everything else did, that everybody knew he was no gentleman. Jeanne kept the Bel Air house. She raised the children. She stayed close to Dean's family even after the marriage ended. She never remarried. She never sought the spotlight. She outlived Dean by nearly 2 decades, dying in 2016 at the age of 88. And in every interview she gave in those final years, she described her marriage to Dean Martin with a complicated warmth that stopped short of bitterness and never quite reached contentment either. She had loved him. She had known exactly what she was loving, and in the end she had taken everything she could carry and left the rest. The man she left behind was already, before the ink was dry on the settlement, making plans for a wedding that would cost $100,000 and feature 22 cages of white doves. Catherine Horn was 25 years old when she met Dean Martin, and she was working as a receptionist at a hair salon in Beverly Hills called Saks on Rodeo. She was not a movie star. She was not a beauty queen. She was not a former showgirl or a socialite or any of the categories the press usually reached for when a famous man took up with a younger woman. She was, by the account of everyone who described her, simply very beautiful and very young and working a job that put her in the path of a man who noticed those things. They were introduced by one of Dean's friends sometime around 1970, while he was still technically married to Jeanne, and the divorce proceedings were grinding through the Los Angeles court system. By 1971, they were photographed together publicly. By 1972, they were a known item in the columns. And on April 25, 1973, 3 weeks after the Jeanne divorce was finalized, Dean Martin married Catherine Horn at his home in Beverly Hills. The wedding cost roughly $100,000. That number, in 1973 dollars, represented what most Americans earned in a decade, and Dean spent it on a single afternoon. Flowers were flown in specially from France. 22 cages of white doves were released during the ceremony. Frank Sinatra was there. Most of the Rat Pack orbit was there. The guest list read like a Beverly Hills directory of everyone who mattered. It was, by every description, an extravaganza. It was also, by every description of people who were paying attention rather than eating the catered food, a performance. Dean Martin had just come off 24 years of marriage to a woman who had managed his household, raised his children, and absorbed his absences with the quiet competence of someone who understood that this was the deal she had signed up for. He was 55 years old. He was, in the plainest sense, a man who had spent his entire adult life being taken care of by capable women while he stood at a microphone and made the world feel good. What he needed from Catherine was not complicated. He needed someone to be there, someone young and warm and uncritical, someone who had not yet accumulated the years of quiet disappointment that Jean wore in the set of her shoulders at parties. What Catherine needed from him is harder to say. She has, in the years since the marriage ended, spoken about it rarely and revealed little. She was 25 when they married, and he was 55. She had a daughter from a previous relationship named Sasha, whom Dean adopted. She had, by getting into this marriage, stepped into one of the most recognizable lives in America, with essentially no preparation for what that meant. The problems started early. Not dramatically, not with the kind of scenes that end up in the columns, but with the slower erosion that happens when two people discover, after the flowers from France have wilted and the doves have flown off, that they don't actually have much to say to each other at the kitchen table. Dean's world was the Rat Pack world, the Vegas world, the world of men who had known each other for decades and communicated in references and in-jokes that went back to the Sands in 1960. Catherine was not part of that world. She was 3 years old when Dean made Rio Bravo. She had grown up watching him on television, the way everyone else had. There was also the drinking, which by 1973 was no longer the curated image of a man with a glass of scotch as a stage prop. It was the real thing, steady and daily, and it made him by turns warm and distant in patterns that were hard to predict and harder to live around. There was the schedule, still relentless despite his age, which kept him away from home for weeks at a time. And there was the fact, which Jean could have told Catherine, and perhaps did not get the chance to, that Dean Martin's idea of an intimate relationship was one in which nobody asked too many questions, and the silences were comfortable rather than loaded. The silences between Dean and Catherine were, after the first year, more loaded than comfortable. By 1975, they were in serious trouble. By early 1976, Dean filed for divorce. The grounds were irreconcilable differences, which was the California equivalent of saying nothing specific while meaning everything general. The marriage had lasted 3 years. It had produced 1 adoption and no biological children, and a settlement that was considerably smaller than what Jean had walked away with, but still substantial enough that Catherine was not left with nothing. She retreated from public life almost immediately after the divorce. She raised Sasha, whose adoption Dean had ensured would stand regardless of what happened between the adults. She did not pursue a career in entertainment. She did not write a memoir. She did not appear on talk shows to describe what it had been like to be married to the king of cool. She simply stepped back, and the spotlight that had found her when she married Dean Martin moved on to other things, and Catherine Horn disappeared from the public record with a thoroughness that suggested she had wanted to disappear from the moment she found herself in it. Dean Martin was 58 years old when the 3rd divorce was finalized. He would never marry again. He had used up his marriages. He had 3 ex-wives, 8 children spread across 3 households, a ranch in Thousand Oaks with a golf course nobody was using, and a Beverly Hills home he would live in alone for the next 19 years. What people who saw him in those years remembered was that he seemed, for the first time in his life, to be actually alone rather than performing aloneness. The glass was still there. The grin was still there. But something behind the grin had changed in a way that the grin could no longer quite cover. He was not done grieving yet. The worst thing that would ever happen to him was still 11 years away. And when it came, in the spring of 1987, it would arrive the same way everything terrible arrives in the lives of men who have spent their whole careers pretending everything is fine, without warning, on an ordinary day, from the sky. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Catherine Horn was 25 years old when she met Dean Martin, and she was working as a receptionist at a hair salon in Beverly Hills called Sax on Rodeo. She was not a movie star. She was not a beauty queen. She was not a former showgirl or a socialite or any of the categories the press usually reached for when a famous man took up with a younger woman. She was, by the account of everyone who described her, simply very beautiful and very young and working a job that put her in the path of a man who noticed those things. They were introduced by one of Dean's friends sometime around 1970, while he was still technically married to Jeanne, and the divorce proceedings were grinding through the Los Angeles court system. By 1971, they were photographed together publicly. By 1972, they were a known item in the columns. And on April 25, 1973, 3 weeks after the Jeanne divorce was finalized, Dean Martin married Catherine Horn at his home in Beverly Hills. The wedding cost roughly $100,000. That number, in 1973 dollars, represented what most Americans earned in a decade, and Dean spent it on a single afternoon. Flowers were flown in specially from France. 22 cages of white doves were released during the ceremony. Frank Sinatra was there. Most of the Rat Pack orbit was there. The guest list read like a Beverly Hills directory of everyone who mattered. It was, by every description, an extravaganza. It was also, by every description of people who were paying attention rather than eating the catered food, a performance. Dean Martin had just come off 24 years of marriage to a woman who had managed his household, raised his children, and absorbed his absences with the quiet competence of someone who understood that this was the deal she had signed up for. He was 55 years old. He was, in the plainest sense, a man who had spent his entire adult life being taken care of by capable women while he stood at a microphone and made the world feel good. What he needed from Catherine was not complicated. He needed someone to be there, someone young and warm and uncritical, someone who had not yet accumulated the years of quiet disappointment that Jean wore in the set of her shoulders at parties. What Catherine needed from him is harder to say. She has, in the years since the marriage ended, spoken about it rarely and revealed little. She was 25 when they married, and he was 55. She had a daughter from a previous relationship named Sasha, whom Dean adopted. She had, by getting into this marriage, stepped into one of the most recognizable lives in America, with essentially no preparation for what that meant. The problems started early. Not dramatically, not with the kind of scenes that end up in the columns, but with the slower erosion that happens when two people discover, after the flowers from France have wilted and the doves have flown off, that they don't actually have much to say to each other at the kitchen table. Dean's world was the Rat Pack world, the Vegas world, the world of men who had known each other for decades and communicated in references and in-jokes that went back to the Sands in 1960. Catherine was not part of that world. She was 3 years old when Dean made Rio Bravo. She had grown up watching him on television, the way everyone else had. There was also the drinking, which by 1973 was no longer the curated image of a man with a glass of scotch as a stage prop. It was the real thing, steady and daily, and it made him by turns warm and distant in patterns that were hard to predict and harder to live around. There was the schedule, still relentless despite his age, which kept him away from home for weeks at a time. And there was the fact, which Jean could have told Catherine, and perhaps did not get the chance to, that Dean Martin's idea of an intimate relationship was one in which nobody asked too many questions, and the silences were comfortable rather than loaded. The silences between Dean and Catherine were, after the first year, more loaded than comfortable. By 1975, they were in serious trouble. By early 1976, Dean filed for divorce. The grounds were irreconcilable differences, which was the California equivalent of saying nothing specific while meaning everything general. The marriage had lasted 3 years. It had produced 1 adoption and no biological children, and a settlement that was considerably smaller than what Jean had walked away with, but still substantial enough that Catherine was not left with nothing. She retreated from public life almost immediately after the divorce. She raised Sasha, whose adoption Dean had ensured would stand regardless of what happened between the adults. She did not pursue a career in entertainment. She did not write a memoir. She did not appear on talk shows to describe what it had been like to be married to the King of Cool. She simply stepped back, and the spotlight that had found her when she married Dean Martin moved on to other things, and Catherine Horn disappeared from the public record with a thoroughness that suggested she had wanted to disappear from the moment she found herself in it. Dean Martin was 58 years old when the third divorce was finalized. He would never marry again. He had used up his marriages. He had 3 ex-wives, 8 children spread across 3 households, a ranch in Thousand Oaks with a golf course nobody was using, and a Beverly Hills home he would live in alone for the next 19 years. What people who saw him in those years remembered was that he seemed, for the first time in his life, to be actually alone rather than performing aloneness. The glass was still there. The grin was still there. But something behind the grin had changed in a way that the grin could no longer quite cover. He was not done grieving yet. The worst thing that would ever happen to him was still 11 years away. And when it came, in the spring of 1987, it would arrive the same way everything terrible arrives in the lives of men who have spent their whole careers pretending everything is fine, without warning, on an ordinary day, from the sky. Dean Paul Martin Jr. had been flying since he was 16 years old. He had gotten his pilot's license the same year most boys were getting their driver's licenses, and from that point on, the sky was where he felt most like himself. He was, in the description of everyone who knew him, exactly the kind of young man who makes a father proud in ways that are hard to articulate. He was handsome in the same dark Italian way as his father. He was charming without trying. He was funny without being a comedian about it. He was also, unlike his father, genuinely at ease with other people in private, not just in public. Dean Sr. performed warmth. Dean Jr. simply had it. He had grown up as Dino Jr., in the particular strange atmosphere of a famous man's household, which meant both enormous privilege and a certain specific kind of loneliness. His parents had divorced when he was still young. His father was, by the time Dino Jr. was forming his clearest memories, already the king of cool, already the Rat Pack, already the man on 40 million television screens every Thursday night. Being Dean Martin's son meant that people always knew who you were, which is not the same thing as people knowing you. He handled it better than most. At 13, he formed a pop group with Desi Arnaz Jr. and a neighbor named Billy Hinche, called Dino, Desi and Billy. They put 2 songs in the Billboard Top 30 in 1965. He was not trading on his father's name exactly, because the music was its own thing. But the name opened the doors, and everyone knew it, including him. He was clear-eyed about it. He had, in that sense, inherited his father's lack of self-delusion, along with his father's cheekbones. He tried acting. He was nominated for a Golden Globe for a 1979 film called Players. He starred in an NBC series called Misfits of Science in 1985 and 1986. He married twice. First to the actress Olivia Hussey in 1971, which ended in divorce in 1978. Then to the Olympic figure skating champion Dorothy Hamill in 1982, which ended in divorce in 1984. He had 1 son, Alexander, from the Hamill marriage. He was also, through all of this, building a serious military career. He had joined the California Air National Guard in 1980 and had risen to the rank of captain in the 196th Tactical Fighter Squadron. He flew F-4 Phantom jets, which were not trainers or observation aircraft. They were combat planes, built for speed and designed for war, requiring a level of skill and nerve that screened out most applicants. He had both. His commanding officers respected him. His fellow pilots liked him. He was, at 35, one of the better fighter pilots in his unit, and he was proud of it in a way that had nothing to do with his last name. He once said, in an interview that only became famous after his death, "The high I get seeing the sun come up is so great that if I die, it would have been worth it." On March 21, 1987, Dean Paul Martin Jr. took off from an airfield in California in an F-4C Phantom on a routine training mission with his weapons systems officer, Captain Ramon Ortiz. They were flying over the San Bernardino Mountains, the same range of mountains that runs through the high desert east of Los Angeles. The weather turned. A snowstorm moved in faster than the forecasts had predicted. Visibility dropped to near nothing. Air traffic controllers at Ontario Airport attempted to redirect the aircraft to avoid the deteriorating conditions. The call either was not heard or came too late. Investigators would later suggest that Dean Paul may have developed vertigo in the whiteout conditions, losing his sense of orientation in the way that kills pilots who push through weather they cannot see through. The F-4 hit the side of San Gorgonio Mountain at approximately 400 miles per hour. The impact was at such speed and at such an angle that the aircraft essentially ceased to exist on contact. Dean Paul Martin Jr. and Captain Ramon Ortiz died instantly. Their bodies were not recovered for nearly a week because the crash site was in terrain that took days to reach in those weather conditions. Search teams had to wait for the storm to pass before they could climb to what was left. Dean Martin was told by telephone. The people who were with him when he got the call have never described exactly what happened in that room. What they have described is what came after, and what came after was a man they did not entirely recognize. He went to identify his son. He made the arrangements. He held himself together in public, because holding himself together in public was the thing he had been doing since he was a teenager in Steubenville, and the audience was not allowed to see the backstage. He sat through the funeral. He accepted the condolences of Sinatra and the others, the men who had known Dino Jr. since he was a child, running around the edges of Rat Pack dinners in Beverly Hills. And then he went home. And he did not really come back. His daughter Diana said it was tough for him and left the understatement to do the work. His friend Paul Anker said it was a huge turning point and that after the crash things really changed. An author named William Keck, who spent time with Dean in his final years, described it as watching a candle without a flame. He was still there. He still greeted people warmly. He still promised to return to the stage someday. The smile was still there. But the thing that had powered the smile was gone. He had been performing ease his entire life. The effortless cool, the glass at half-mast, the half-closed eyes of a man who had seen everything and found it all mildly amusing. It had been a performance, always, and he had been good enough at it that even the people who knew him best sometimes forgot it was a performance. What the loss of his son did was remove his reason to perform it. Not his ability, his reason. He could still have put on the show. He simply no longer saw the point. He was 69 years old. He had buried his golden boy in the mountains east of Los Angeles. He had 8 children and 3 ex-wives and a house in Beverly Hills that was very large and very quiet. He had Sinatra nearby and the other friends, and the restaurants where he ate alone most nights because he preferred eating alone to performing warmth for a table full of people. He ate alone at the same Italian restaurant on La Cienega Boulevard almost every night for the last 8 years of his life. The owner knew his order. The staff left him alone. He sat at his table and had his dinner, and nobody asked him to be Dean Martin for the duration of the meal. It was, in its way, the first real peace he had found since Steubenville. The last 8 years of Dean Martin's life were lived almost entirely in private, which for a man who had spent 50 years performing in public was its own kind of statement. He ate dinner alone at La Familia restaurant on La Cienega Boulevard most nights. He ordered the same things. The staff knew not to make a fuss. Occasionally fans recognized him and approached respectfully, and he was always gracious, always warm, always the version of himself that the public expected. Then he went back to his table and finished his meal and went home. He watched television. He played golf, alone or with a small rotation of old friends. He talked on the phone with his children. He did not record. He did not perform. He gave almost no interviews. The man who had been on 40 million screens every Thursday night for 9 years simply stepped back from the machinery of fame and waited, without any apparent urgency, for whatever came next. Frank Sinatra tried to pull him back. In 1988, Sinatra organized what he called the Together Again Tour, reuniting Dean and Sammy Davis Jr. for a farewell run that was supposed to play arenas across the country. It was meant to be the Rat Pack's final bow, 3 old men doing what they had always done, one last time. Dean agreed to do it. He showed up for the early dates, and then, about a week into the tour, he walked away. He told the promoters he was sick. He told Sinatra he couldn't do it. The official explanation was health issues, which was partly true and partly not the whole story. What was fully true was that standing on a stage and performing effortless joy was something he no longer had access to. The loss of his son had not left him enough to work with. He apologized. He withdrew. Sammy and Frank finished the tour with Liza Minnelli filling Dean's slot, and it was not the same thing at all, and everyone knew it. Sammy Davis Jr. died in May of 1990. Dean attended the funeral. He sat in the front row and accepted the grief of losing one of the closest friends of his adult life, with the same quiet composure he had brought to everything since 1987. Frank Sinatra sat beside him. The two of them were the last of the original pack, and both of them knew it. The health problems that had given him the excuse to leave the Together Again tour became, in the early 1990s, real and serious. He had emphysema, the result of a lifetime of cigarettes that had always been part of the act and the reality both. His lungs were failing. He was on oxygen at home for stretches. He lost weight. He moved more slowly. The handsome man who had walked into every room in Hollywood as though he owned it was diminished in the physical way that illness diminishes men, and he bore it without complaint and without drama, because complaint and drama were not part of the character he had built, and he had been playing the character for so long it had become indistinguishable from the man. Jean, his second wife, stayed close through all of it. Not romantically. Whatever they had been to each other during the marriage was past, and both of them knew it. But she was the mother of 3 of his children, and she had known him since 1948, and she understood him in the way that only the people who knew you before the fame understand you. She called. She visited. She was, in the quiet arithmetic of his final years, more present than the woman he had married after her. His children visited. Diana visited. Craig visited. Richie visited. Gina visited. The children he had, over the decades, been absent from in the ways that working entertainers are absent, were present for him now in the ways that mattered. He was a better father to visit than he had been a father to live with, which is not an uncommon calculation in the lives of men who spent their best hours on a stage. On December 25, 1995, Dean Martin died at his home in Beverly Hills. He was 78 years old. The cause was acute respiratory failure, the emphysema having finally taken what it had been working toward for years. He died on Christmas Day, which was either a coincidence or the kind of detail that a man who had spent his life in show business would have appreciated for its narrative efficiency. Frank Sinatra was told by telephone. He did not speak publicly for several days. When he did, he said simply that Dean was his brother, and that the word was not going to be the same without him. The lights on the Las Vegas Strip were dimmed in his honor, as they had been for his friend Sammy Davis Jr. 5 years earlier. He was buried at Westwood Village Memorial Park Cemetery in Los Angeles, not far from the grave of Marilyn Monroe, which would have amused him. His headstone reads, "Everybody loves somebody sometime." Betty McDonald, his first wife, the woman who had married a club singer from Ohio before there was anything to be famous about, was still alive. She would outlive him by 7 years, dying in 2002. She had 4 children with him and a marriage that ended before he became the man the world remembers, and she carried both facts quietly for the rest of her life. Jean Bieger, his second wife, outlived him by 21 years. She died in 2016 at 88. The woman who had bought her husband a golf course to keep him home and watched him leave anyway, who had walked away from 24 years of marriage with $6.5 million and a broken heart that she never made a public production of. She was, by the account of every person who knew her in those final decades, at peace with what her life had been. Catherine Horn, his third wife, the young woman from the salon with the extravagant wedding and the 3-year marriage, had long since disappeared back into a private life. She had the daughter Dean adopted, and she had the settlement, and she had the experience of having been, for a brief incandescent moment, married to one of the most famous men in the world. She made no public claims on his memory. She let him go cleanly, which was perhaps the kindest thing anyone did for Dean Martin in the last years of his life. And Dean Paul, his golden boy, was still on that mountain in San Bernardino, still 35 years old, still flying, still the person whose absence had turned a candle into something without a flame. Look at the whole shape of it. A barber's son from Steubenville who couldn't speak English until he was 5 years old, who dropped out of school because he thought he knew better, who bootlegged whiskey and dealt cards and took punches for $10 a match, who turned himself into the most convincing performance of effortless cool in the history of American entertainment, who married 3 times and left twice, and was left once, who had 8 children and was fully present for almost none of their childhoods, and loved every one of them in his imperfect, distant, genuine way, who lost the one he loved most in a snowstorm over a mountain, and who spent the last 8 years of his life eating alone at an Italian restaurant on La Cienega Boulevard, waiting for it to be over. He made it look easy. That was always the trick. The drinking, the grinning, the glass at half-mast, the half-lidded eyes of a man for whom nothing was ever quite enough trouble to take seriously. All of it was the work. All of it cost something. And what it cost, in the end, was everything the 3 women who married him already knew, and none of them could say out loud while he was alive. That Dean Martin was never as relaxed as he looked. That the ease was the performance, and the grief was the man. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.